So imagine being stabbed over 2 dozen times, being almost decapitated, disemboweled, sexually assaulted, beaten, and left for dead in the middle of nowhere. Well, that's exactly what happened to a woman named Alison Botha, and today we're going to talk about her incredible story of survival. But before we get into today's story, if you guys are new here, my name is Ashley, and this is HeeBeeJeeBeezTV. And on this channel, we like to talk about stuff like true crime, unsolved mysteries, and the paranormal. And if you're already subscribed, welcome back. Thank you guys so much for the support. Now let's get into today's story. So Alison was only 27 years old when this entire ordeal happened, and she was actually living in a small town called Port Elizabeth in South Africa. Now, she had a relatively normal childhood, except for the fact that when she was 10 years old, her parents ended up divorcing. After the divorce, she opted to live with her mother and her younger brother, and they stayed in the same town of Port Elizabeth. And she was actually quite popular in high school. And when it came time for graduation, she ended up choosing a different route than most people would. She didn't want to go to university. She didn't want to go to college. She wanted to spend time exploring the world. And so essentially, that's exactly what she did. She took some time off and just started traveling and enjoying her life. Eventually, she would return home. She missed being at home. And, eventually you get older and you realize that you have responsibilities and it's time to kind of grow up. So Alison returns home and she ends up landing a job as an insurance broker. Then on December 18th, 1994, Alison's entire life would completely change. So it was a normal evening. Alison was having a night out with a lot of her friends. They actually had gone to the beach. They were hanging out, but it started to get dark. And so not necessarily wanting to end the evening early, Alison was kind enough to invite all of her friends back to her apartment for some pizza, some drinks, and some board games. They had a great night together. Everything was normal. But slowly, one friend started leaving, followed by another and another, until eventually there was just one girl left. And this girl actually, it's not specified whether she didn't drive or she didn't have a car, but basically Alison offered to give her a ride home. So the girl accepts, and together they head off for a short trip to this girl's home. Everything was totally normal on the way there. Alison gets to her friend's home, drops her off, and then she starts driving back home to her own apartment. Everything was totally fine on the way home up until she gets to the parking lot of her apartment. So she's turning off the car and she's about to get out. Her guard was completely down. It was just completely normal. So she turns to the passenger seat because she had some laundry there that she was going to take up with her. But before she can do that, she, in her peripheral view, ends up seeing something moving in the background. And before she can actually act on it, she realizes that there's a strange man approaching her car with a knife in his hand. And just as quickly, he opens the driver's side of the car. Right away, she notices that this guy is holding a huge knife in his hands and he's just staring at her. She's staring at him, and all he says to her is, "Move over or I'll kill you." So of course, like anyone else, Alison did not want to die. She just wanted to make sure that she somehow got out of the situation safely. So she complied and moved over to the passenger seat. So the guy jumps into the driver's seat and he starts backing the car out and he starts driving it off. And throughout this ordeal, he tells Alison that his name is actually Clinton and that he didn't really want to hurt her, and that the reason he was doing all this was because essentially he just wanted to borrow her car for an hour, which is totally acceptable. During their drive, Clinton starts asking Alison a bunch of personal questions, like what's her name? Where does she live? What does she do for work? Does she have a boyfriend? Who her friends are? Some of the questions were quite invasive, but Alison was just playing along. She didn't want to upset this guy, so she wanted to make sure that she kept her chances of surviving on her side. And so she lied about a lot of these questions, and she ended up telling him that she actually did have a boyfriend and he was waiting for her at her apartment. So as they're talking, Alison ends up telling him that if he were to let her go, that she wouldn't tell anyone about what happened. She told him that he could keep the car, that it would be like nothing happened at all. But Clinton tells her that this is not what he wants. He's not interested in that. And he actually just really wants some company that night. Clinton then drives to another part of the city and he ends up picking up another man, which was one of his friends. Alison recalled when this other friend got into the car, she remembers feeling like there was a complete change in the environment. The energy had shifted. And when she looked at him face to face, she said that she knew that trouble had gotten into the car, that she was essentially looking at someone that was very, very evil. So they pick up this guy and they end up driving to a very, very remote area of the town. And this entire time, Alison is completely terrified, not knowing what was about to happen to her. What Alison didn't know, though, was that these two men were actually very dangerous individuals. Both of them had a history of violence, but not just regular violence. They had a very aggressive tendency towards women, and they had actually been charged with rape of other women in the past. And on top of this, the name Clinton was fake. Clinton was actually a man named Franz Dutoit, and his friend was Thunes Kruger. Both had criminal records and an extensive violence towards women, where Franz had actually set his school dorm on fire when he was just 13 years old, and it was also reported that he had some very dark sexual fantasies growing up. So once they got to this isolated area, they stopped the car, and that's when they finally revealed their true intentions. They both turned to Alison and they told her that they didn't actually want to borrow her car, and what they really wanted to do was have sex with her. They then asked Alison if she was planning on fighting them, and of course, not wanting to die, Alison tells them that she wasn't planning on fighting them and essentially agreed to what was about to happen next. Both men sadly then proceeded to have their way with Alison, and just when Alison thought the entire ordeal was over, that's when things took a very dark turn. Both of these men were not done with Alison just yet, and before Alison realized what they were doing, they had actually began to suffocate her. So they're choking her and choking her, trying to make sure that she dies. And eventually Alison does lose consciousness, but then they realized that she actually hadn't died. Both men then decided that they needed to take things up a notch, and that's when they decided to start stabbing Alison. They actually ended up stabbing her approximately 30 times across her abdomen, and Alison actually recalled in the middle of all this that Clinton specified that he wanted to destroy her reproductive organs. And so as he's stabbing her all these times, he's trying to target that specific area of her body. But by some miracle, all of those stab wounds completely missed her reproductive organs. At that point, both men thought to themselves that Alison had to be dead, that there was no way she could survive that. And so they were about to head off when they saw Alison's leg actually twitch. So not wanting to leave her alive, they couldn't leave any witnesses there. They knew they had to do something more drastic. Alison at this point was going in and out of consciousness. She was losing so much blood at this point, and a lot of the pain had subsided quite a lot, so much so that she ended up thinking that this was some sort of nightmare. But the truth was that it was way, way far from that. During the peaks where she was actually able to open her eyes, she recalls seeing one of the guys, Clinton, on top of her, and all she could see was his arm moving back and forth, and she didn't fully understand what was happening. She couldn't put it all together at that point, but she did recall that during all of these movements, she could hear a wet slushing sound. Then, to her surprise, both of the men stopped what they were doing and they stood up and backed away, almost as if they were admiring at what they had just done. Alison then said that they started speaking in Afrikaans, which is the language they speak in South Africa, and they started talking to each other, asking if they thought that she was actually dead, to which one of them replied, "There's no way she could survive that." And this, fortunately for Alison, this is where the men ended up slipping up. Because they thought that she was going to die, or that she was basically dead at this point, they stopped using their fake names and started referring to themselves using their real names, revealing to Alison that Clinton was actually Franz. So satisfied that Alison is dead at this point, they both get in the car, leave her on the side of the road on a pile of dirt, and they drive off. When Alison finally woke up, she instantly knew that she wanted to survive, but in case that she didn't, she wanted to make sure that she left some sort of clue behind in order for police to catch whoever did this to her. So she takes one of her hands and starts writing in the dirt the names of each of the men. And then underneath that, she writes, "I love mom," just in case she didn't make it. She wanted to make sure that her mom knew how much she loved her. So as she's lying there in the dirt, looking up at the night sky, she's kind of waiting for death to arrive, not really knowing what she's going to do. She notices something off in the far distance. And what she ends up seeing is a car light. She's not too far off from the highway, the main road, and there's cars passing by. So this is when it clicks in her head and the real will to live really kicks in for her. She realizes that if she could somehow manage to get herself to the edge of the road and let a car see her, that she could potentially get some help and survive. So somehow, by the grace of God, she gets herself to somewhat stand up. But before she can fully do that, she realizes that something is horribly, horribly wrong. As she's trying to stand up in order to get to the road, she realizes that her head is falling backwards. And that's when she understood what was happening when the man was on top of her. That slushing sound that she heard was her throat being slashed open. They had slashed Alison's throat 16 times, and she was basically almost fully decapitated. But that was not it. As she's trying to stand up and use one of her hands to literally hold her head from falling off, she then feels something wet and slimy coming from her stomach. So she looks down, and that's when she sees that her stomach has been ripped open. She's been disemboweled, and what she's seeing and feeling are her intestines sticking out of her stomach. So all she could do at this point was use her other hand to keep as much of her intestines inside in order for her to survive. So with both hands fully occupied, literally one hand holding her head up and the other keeping her insides inside, she's struggling to get to the edge of the road, but she's somehow pulling her way there. She wanted to survive. She wanted to make sure that whoever did this to her faced justice. So she managed to drag herself to the edge of the road, but it wasn't easy. She was losing so much blood. Her eyesight was blurry. She was completely exhausted, but somehow she managed to get to the edge of the road where the white line was. And that's where she collapsed and decided that this is where she was going to stay. And she would just hope that someone would come by very soon. So another miracle in this story was a man named Tian Ehlers, and he actually happened to be on vacation in Port Elizabeth after having spent some time in Johannesburg, which is also in South Africa. So that particular night on December 18th, he was driving down the stretch of road. It was a dark, isolated road. He wasn't really expecting to see anything out of the ordinary. It was quiet. And so as he's driving, he then sees something laying on the side of the road. And to his surprise, when he gets close enough, he realizes that this is a human being and they look like they need some help. This was the help that Alison had been hoping and praying for. But what she didn't know is that Tian would literally be an angel sent from God. You see, Tian wasn't just a regular citizen. He wasn't just a passerby that, could potentially just call 911. Tian actually was a veterinarian student, which meant that he had medical training that could potentially save Alison's life, at least until the ambulance got there. So he gets out of his car and goes over to Alison, and to his horror, he is completely shocked that Alison was alive considering the wounds that she had. So he calls 911, and while they're waiting for the police and the ambulance to arrive, he uses his training to treat as many of Alison's wounds as possible, including putting her thyroid back inside her throat. So Alison arrives to the hospital, and Tian had actually gone with her in the ambulance. And when they arrived to the hospital, doctors are also just as shocked as Tian was. They were completely surprised that someone with these sort of injuries could still be alive. And one of the doctors there had been practicing for 16 years, and he was quoted as saying that these were some of the worst injuries he had ever seen in his career up to that point. Miraculously, the ER doctor there that night also happened to be a throat specialist, but that wasn't the end of the miracles that evening. So while Clinton was on top of Alison slashing her throat, somehow he managed to not only miss her artery, but he also missed her voice box. But what he did nick was her windpipe, which actually allowed her to keep breathing instead of suffocating on her own blood. And essentially, this is what helped Alison survive. It took months and months of operations and rehabilitation for Alison to fully recover, but she was able to give police all of the information they needed. She was able to remember what these guys looked like, their names, what happened, all of the details that you would need to make an investigation quite easily. And that's exactly what happened. Both of these guys were caught very quickly by police. Obviously, both men were charged with kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder. And of course, both were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison in August of 1995. But that doesn't mean that these guys just took their sentencing like that. They tried to get out of it as much as possible. Franz actually came up with an idea to say that he was a Satanist and that the devil had made him do it. And unfortunately, it didn't end there. If what they did to Alison wasn't enough, these guys just wanted to keep adding insult to injury. And when Alison, this was years later, when Alison was working on a documentary, Franz actually heard about this documentary and said that he wanted to be a part of it, to give his perspective, to give details that no one else knew. But in order for this, he wanted to make some demands. In exchange for an on-camera interview, Franz said he wanted a letter of forgiveness from Alison that had to be signed by her. And secondly, he said that he wanted profits from the money Alison was making from not only this documentary, but from her book and all of her speaking engagements as well. And the way he justified this was because he said that if he hadn't attacked Alison that night, then she wouldn't have had these experiences in order to profit from to begin with. Surviving this entire ordeal was something that no one thought should have been possible, but somehow Alison did, and she decided to use this entire experience for good. She would then spend years traveling across the world. She went to approximately 35 different countries, speaking to women survivors and women who have experienced this sort of abuse as a motivational speaker, and to just give hope that life does get better. But the biggest miracle in all of this, according to Alison, is that the attackers actually did end up missing all of her reproductive organs. And in 2003, she was able to have her very first baby, which ended up being a boy. As for Tian, the man that saved her, this entire experience changed him as well. And he decided to change his career path. He went from wanting to be a veterinarian to changing his career to become a doctor. And he stayed in touch with Alison, and they formed a friendship. They formed a really nice bond, so much so that he actually ended up being the doctor who delivered Alison's second baby. So being one of the most astonishing stories of survival, Alison's ordeal was turned into a documentary, and it's actually available on Amazon. It's called Alison, and she also wrote a book which is called I Have Life, which I highly recommend you watch it and read the book. It gives you a much more detailed account of what happened from Alison's perspective and just life after that. Well, that is a completely insane story. When I first came across this story, I knew I had to make a video on it. I was completely shocked that someone could survive that much physical damage to their bodies. I know there's miracles that happen every day, but something like this is completely extraordinary and definitely deserved a little bit more attention. So let me know what you guys think about today's video. Do you have any other survival stories that you'd like to share? Or even if you just have any other case suggestions, I'm always open to suggestions. But that's going to do it for today's video. Thank you so much for joining me, guys, and I will see you in the next one.